And from a stress reduction viewpoint, the less we are in our head, the majority of the time, the better we will feel. And that is really the general message of all my stuff, is that we overthink. And there's other ways of labeling that. But anxiety and stress, I believe, comes primarily from overthinking. That is the root of a lot of that, troubling situations we find ourselves in, is just from overthinking.
I think, your foundational thesis is, no matter what you do, thinking, decisions, anything else, you have to be in a state of calmness and goodness before making any decision or pivoting to any place in life. Is that it, Tim?
Ideally, yes, but I mean, the reality is so much more, is much muddier. Okay, and there's a lot more of a gray area, and honestly, that's what these days I'm most interested in exploring, is that gray area. And at the same time, there's all these tricks or ways to clear out that thinking quickly that we can access relatively easily. For instance, if we talk out loud to ourselves for a few minutes, we can go from being really in our head to kind of being more out of our head and more feeling aligned or in flow with the present moment. But there's going to be crap in our head a lot of the time, and it's not realistic, in my opinion, usually, to say like, well, I can't, I can't do anything until I feel clear. Because just the reality of it is that, well, you're going to be waiting all day, I mean, it's kind of like, you poop on the pot or you get off, you know what I mean? It's one or the other. So, yeah, it's more like dealing with it actively. This is like pragmatic advice. I don't really like giving highfalutin spiritual advice, because from what I've found, and I'm sure that you share this sentiment at least somewhat, it's the real deep truths you can't even articulate. It's like it's so profound. So it's more like, all right, well, how can I help myself and in turn help others by sharing practical ways to just feel better and more sane going about my life? That's spiritual practice a lot of the time. It's not like, well, what's God? What's coming? It's we have to get more out of our head about just what's going on in our day-to-day life when everything is very muddy and muddled and what have you.
So by out of your head, I'm assuming you mean a place where the answers will come up, the solutions, or at least the acceptance will come up, right? Something like the unconscious, our soul, the place that really should be driving our lives, not our ego.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but like people like to say they like to be in flow. I guess that's what I'm talking about, is that if you are able to notice that there's a lot of thoughts, a lot of stress in your mind right now, you just being aware of that and then working through that is very helpful. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. That's a big problem. They assume the stress is there and they don't know how to work through it. And so I help people work through it, as I mentioned, speaking out loud, for instance, is a very good way to do that. Meditation is a very good way to do that. Moving around physically is a really good way to do that. And getting in touch with noticing when you feel like you are in flow, noticing how that feels and making that more of a priority to get there during your day-to-day life when things inevitably do get messy and muddled. Makes a huge difference over the long run,
Yeah, very important, I think. Yeah, self-awareness of what's going on with us, and as you say, in the flow of life. So let's talk about the self-talking and how it works. Obviously, we do see it in life. Children will sit there and just blah 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 until they can work things out, and we sort of lose that as adults. Obviously, Jung talked about the active imagination, creating sort of this theater where you create this character and have a dialogue with it. But what are some examples or techniques of self-talk that you
Yeah.
recommend? Besides, damn you cut me off, you piece of shit, or something like that,
Right. Well,
on the road or something.
That's a good place to start, though. Actually, is the issue is like, let's say we're in the car and someone cuts us off.
Hmm.
Can we swear here or no? Or well, I'll try to
Yeah,
keep.
yeah, yeah.
I'm going to try to keep it G. Just kidding. The, if let's say someone cuts us off, so we get pissed off. We say, what the fuck are you doing? This is a good example because it's extreme. What we could actually do is keep on going with that. We could keep on yelling at that person, but we become more self-aware when we do that. Now, it's very important not to drive into the the person that cut you off. But if you really say, like, what, if you kind of lose it and start screaming at yourself, screaming at life, talking out loud, like, how the hell can this happen to me? What the fuck is going on? Fuck all this. If you do that for a couple minutes, you're releasing all of this overthinking pent up stress by doing that. That's an extreme example. That's why I kind of like it. But let's say that, you've had a long day at work or what have you, and you feel stressed out. You can then, you can take a walk or go to your car, close the door, and just start talking out loud honestly to yourself. Don't censor yourself. That's, I think, the key is be uncensored and open with yourself. And you can also do this in a very loving manner. Like, I love you. I know you're doing the best you can. You can speak out loud to yourself in 100 different ways. The key is make it out loud. So in other words, in The Joy of Not Thinking, I say it's like those old cartoons where you have like the devil on one shoulder and then you have the angel on the other shoulder. Now the devil is your inner self-talk. That's your overthinking. That's going the whole day and, potentially annoying and stressing you out. Your outer voice, using your outer voice enables that inner self-talk, that devil, to be neutralized really, really easily.
Hmm.
And it's just something we don't, children know it. We intuitively know it. And it's like, it's a built-in part of our physiology, I would say. And then, we kind of lose it. We just don't use it. It's a tool we don't usually dare use. I mean, if that advice sounds crazy, it's going to sound crazy to a lot of people. Like, especially if someone cuts you off, if you get really angry, to proceed to get angrier instead of calming down, like that's like,
Hmm.
whoa, that's kind of like, exactly what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. Like Trungpa, he had that, he always talks about crazy wisdom. He was a Tibetan teacher who started Shambhala and Naropa and all that stuff in the States. But like that crazy wisdom mentality is kind of getting alive and like having that vigor. And it's like, that is such a liberating and powerful state, but it's also a trickster state and very contrarian to what we're used to doing to neutralize stress.
No, it makes sense. And it is a pity because in this culture, we are taught that if you walk by and you see some guy talking to himself on the road, on the street, you're like, oh, this guy is likely has some mental problems. Somehow, what happened? Why did suddenly, like you said, this active imagination, self-talk became kind of mocked by our culture?
Yes. The good thing now, though, is everyone seemingly can be on their phones, so you can you always have
Yeah.
that. They're just talking on the phone, but of course, that person used to maybe be considered, some kind of a sage or something like that, and now they're considered mentally ill. And as we all know who are listening to this, there's a fine line between it's again, it's sage and madness is also almost always they're very close to each other and they intermingle.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and what's cool is you can be very sane and mature and still do something outrageous like this for 5 or 10 minutes. And The Joy of Not Thinking, um, I talk a lot about being playfully active, like
Hmm.
seemingly crazily playfully active, where you're screaming or banging your chest, jumping up and down. And if you do something like that, like for a minute or two, if you get really physically active, you're going to notice that your overthinking basically dissipates. It cannot compete with that kind of physical outward action. And again, this is something children know. That's why they run all around and like they release all this energy, and then they take a nap. It's natural. It's just we don't do it anymore. So
Yeah, our minds are like nuclear furnaces. Like I said, they're always thinking, so they need places to go. I don't know there's a saying, I don't know if it was Stephen Heller who once said, what's the difference between a mystic and a madman? And the difference is a mystic knows when to keep his mouth shut.